August 18, 1942. 2200 hours. Taivu Point. Guadalcanal. The humid air hangs like a wet wool blanket over the black sands as Colonel Kionao Ichiki steps off the landing craft. The surf crashes rhythmically behind him, masking the sound of 900 pairs of hobnailed boots shuffling onto the beach. He adjusts the strap of his binoculars and peers into the wall of jungle that looms ahead. A dense, impenetrable mass of shadows that seems to breathe in the darkness. There is no fear in his heart, only a burning impatience to engage the enemy and a supreme confidence that the Americans hiding in the brush are nothing more than a disorganized rabble waiting to be swept aside by the Emperor's chosen warriors. The men of the Ichiki detachment, the elite first element of the 28th Infantry Regiment, share their commander's arrogant certainty. They are hardened veterans of the campaigns in China and Manchuria, soldiers who have never tasted the bitterness of defeat. As they unload crates of ammunition and meager rations of rice from the destroyers, they joke quietly among themselves about the softness of the Western soldiers they have come to slaughter. They carry only 7 days of food because they believe the operation will be over in 3. In their minds, this is not a desperate war for survival, but a punitive expedition to chastise a minor insolence. They tighten their puttees and check the actions of their Arisaka Type 38 rifles. Unaware that they have just stepped into a graveyard, Colonel Ichiki unfolds a map under the dim, shielded glow of a flashlight, his finger tracing the coastline toward the west. The intelligence reports provided by the Imperial General Headquarters are dangerously optimistic. They assure him that the American force occupying the airfield consists of perhaps 2,000 men, mostly construction laborers and support personnel with low morale. In reality, over 11,000 United States Marines, heavily armed and digging in for a fight to the death, wait behind coils of barbed wire and registered artillery zones. Ichiki does not wait for the rest of his regiment to arrive. To wait would be to share the glory. He snaps the map shut, orders the column to form up, and signals the advance toward the Lunga perimeter. The march west along the coast is a grueling introduction to the hostile geography of the Solomon Islands. The soldiers struggle through loose sand that sucks at their boots, while land crabs scuttle across their paths in the moonlight. To their left, the jungle presents a chaotic tangle of vines, rotting vegetation, and towering palms that block out the stars. The heat is oppressive even long after sunset, causing sweat to soak through their cotton uniforms within minutes. Mosquitoes, the silent carriers of the malaria that will later decimate armies, feast on the exposed skin of the marching men. Despite the physical discomfort, the discipline of the detachment remains ironclad, their pace relentless as they close the distance to the enemy airfield. By the afternoon of August 20, the vanguard of the detachment reaches the banks of the Ilu River, which the Japanese maps have mistakenly identified as the Tenaru. The river is a stagnant, dark ribbon of water separated from the sea by a narrow sandbar. On the opposite bank, all is silent. The coconut grove looks peaceful, the fronds swaying gently in the ocean breeze. Ichiki observes the terrain through his field glasses, noting the lack of movement. He assumes the Americans have fled into the jungle or are too terrified to show themselves. He does not see the camouflaged positions of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, or the muzzles of the M1000. 917 Browning heavy machine guns trained on the very sandbar he intends to cross. Night falls, plunging the battlefield into absolute darkness. The air becomes thick with tension as the Japanese soldiers fix their long Type 30 bayonets, the steel clicking ominously into place. Ichiki issues his orders with the calm demeanor of a man organizing a training exercise. The plan is simple and brutal, a frontal assault across the sandbar to breach the American lines, followed by close-quarters combat to rout the defenders. He disdains flanking maneuvers or reconnaissance, believing that the spiritual superiority of the Japanese soldier is enough to overcome any material disadvantage. At 0300 hours, a green flare arcs into the sky, sputtering and hissing, signaling the beginning of the slaughter. A scream of banzai erupts from hundreds of throats, shattering the silence of the tropical night. The first wave of Japanese infantry surges forward onto the sandbar, their silhouettes illuminated by the eerie light of the flare. They run headlong into a wall of flying steel. The Marine positions on the opposite bank explode with muzzle flashes, the heavy machine guns chugging rhythmically as they traverse the narrow strip of sand. Bullets tear through the ranks of the charging soldiers, shattering bone and ripping through flesh. Men drop in mid-stride, their bodies piling up in heaps. But those behind them do not falter. They clamber over the dead and dying, driven by a fanatical indoctrination that views surrender as worse than death. The chaos intensifies as the Marines unleash their 37mm anti-tank guns, loaded with canister shot. The effect is devastating. The guns act like giant shotguns, spraying thousands of steel balls into the massed Japanese infantry. The sandbar is transformed into a butcher shop. Limbs are severed, and torsos are eviscerated in the blink of an eye. The roar of the battle drowns out the screams of the wounded. A cacophony of explosions, automatic fire, and the frantic shouts of officers trying to maintain momentum. Through the smoke and flying sand, Colonel Ichiki watches in disbelief. The enemy is not running. They are holding their ground with a ferocity that contradicts everything he has been told about the Western fighting spirit. Despite the horrific casualties, the Japanese soldiers manage to reach the Marine lines. Engaging in savage hand-to-hand combat, bayonets clash with combat knives, and men wrestle in the bloody sand, striking each other with rifle butts and helmets. The darkness is illuminated by the flash of grenades and the traces of machine gun fire. But the Marine defense is too deep, their firepower too overwhelming. The assault stalls, then crumbles. The survivors are forced to retreat to the cover of the coconut grove on the east bank, leaving hundreds of their comrades dead on the sandbar. The pristine white sand is now stained a deep, dark crimson, soaking up the blood of the first element. Dawn breaks on August 21, revealing the full extent of the catastrophe. The tropical sun rises over a scene of utter devastation. Bodies lie in tangled heaps, some half buried in the sand, others floating in the stagnant water of the Ilu River. Flies begin to gather in thick, buzzing clouds. But the battle is not over. As the sun climbs higher, the ground begins to tremble. From the west, the distinctive clatter of tracks signals the arrival of American M3 Stuart light tanks. To the Japanese infantrymen huddled in their shallow foxholes, these machines looked like iron monsters, impervious to their rifle fire and light mortars. The psychological shock of seeing armor on this jungle island is profound. The tanks roll onto the sandbar and into the coconut grove, their machine guns strafing the Japanese positions. Then, they do something that haunts the survivors for the rest of their short lives. The tanks do not just shoot, they crush. They drive over the foxholes, their steel tracks grinding the living and the dead into the earth. The sound of bones snapping under the weight of the armor mixes with the mechanical roar of the engines. It is a methodical extermination. The Japanese soldiers, lacking heavy anti-tank weapons, attack the tanks with magnetic mines and suicide charges. But it is a futile gesture. The invincible detachment is being erased from existence. Colonel Ichiki, wounded and surrounded, retreats deeper into the jungle with the remnants of his command staff. His uniform is torn and stained with mud and blood. The arrogant confidence of the landing at Taivu Point has vanished, replaced by a hollow, crushing shame. He realizes now the magnitude of his error. He has underestimated the enemy, and the price of his hubris is the destruction of his regiment. The glorious victory he promised to the Emperor has turned into a humiliating defeat. Around him, his junior officers look to him for guidance, but his eyes are vacant, staring at a future he will not live to see. In a small clearing shielded by mangled palm trees, Colonel Ichiki prepares for the end. He orders the regimental colors, the sacred flag entrusted to him by the Emperor, to be burned to prevent its capture. The flames consume the silk cloth, the gold embroidery turning to ash. It is the final act of a commander who has failed. He unbuckles his sword and kneels on the damp earth, facing north toward the imperial palace. With a steady hand, he draws his Nambu pistol, or perhaps his blade accounts will vary, but the result is the same. He takes his own life, choosing ritual suicide over the dishonor of captivity. The Battle of the Tenaru is over. Of the 900 men who landed with such high hopes, nearly 800 lie dead. The Americans bulldoze the bodies into mass graves, the smell of death hanging heavy over the island. Back at the Japanese headquarters in Rabaul, the news of the annihilation strikes like a thunderclap. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi receives the report with a mixture of disbelief and dread. The mopping-up operation has failed, the sleeping dragon of America has fully awakened, and the green hell of Guadalcanal has claimed its first victims. The time for arrogance is over. The time for starvation and despair is about to begin. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi stands on the deck of a destroyer slicing through the dark waters of the Iron Bottom Sound in late August 1942. Unlike the impulsive Ichiki, Kawaguchi is a thoughtful, almost philosophical commander, known for his distinguished long mustache and a reputation for unconventional tactics. However, the report of the Ichiki detachment's annihilation hangs over his head like a dark cloud, forcing a recalibration of strategy. He commands the 35th Infantry Brigade, a force significantly larger than Ichiki's. Yet he still operates under the fatal assumption that the American Marines are soft adversaries who will crumble under a coordinated bayonet attack from the rear. Upon landing east of the American perimeter, Kawaguchi rejects the suicidal frontal assault strategy that doomed his predecessor. He devises a complex plan to strike the enemy from their undefended rear, necessitating a march through the heart of the island's interior. The soldiers of the Kawaguchi Brigade shoulder their packs, heavy with ammunition and meager rations, and step into the rainforest. Immediately, the Green Hell asserts its dominance over the Imperial Army. The maps provided by headquarters are practically useless blanks, depicting flat terrain where jagged coral ridges and festering swamps await to break the bodies and spirits of the marching men. The march becomes a nightmare of endurance that saps the fighting strength of the brigade before a single shot is fired. Soldiers hack their way through walls of twisting vines and wait-a-bit thorns that tear at uniforms and skin alike. Heavy artillery pieces, essential for the upcoming assault, are abandoned in the mud as the terrain becomes impassable for anything but light infantry. Men slip down ravines, breaking limbs, or vanish silently into the swift currents of jungle rivers. The humidity is a physical weight, suffocating the troops as they trudge forward, their cohesion dissolving into a single file line of exhausted, gasping men. By September 12, the vanguard of the brigade finally emerges from the jungle south of Henderson Field, facing a grassy, coral spine that dominates the approach to the airfield. This is Lunga Ridge, later known as Bloody Ridge, a position defended by a chaotic mix of Marine raiders and paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. Kawaguchi's forces are scattered and disoriented from the tortuous approach march, forcing him to delay the attack. Communications are non-existent, and the coordinated three-pronged strike he envisioned devolves into a piecemeal assault. Despite the confusion, the order is given to fix bayonets and prepare to seize the high ground. As night falls, the Japanese infantry launch their first assault against the ridge. Screaming battle cries meant to terrify the defenders. Red tracers stitch the darkness, crisscrossing the narrow grassy slopes where men fight and die in intimate proximity. The Marines, dug into shallow foxholes, unleash a withering storm of fire, but the Japanese soldiers crawl over their own dead to close the distance. They infiltrate the forward positions, forcing the raiders back yard by bloody yard. The air is thick with the smell of cordite and the guttural shouts of men engaged in primal, hand-to-hand combat, stabbing and bludgeoning in the pitch blackness. The following night brings the decisive climax of the battle as Kawaguchi throws his remaining reserves into a final, desperate heave. The Japanese officers, brandishing their swords in the moonlight, lead wave after wave up the steep, slippery slopes directly into the teeth of Marine artillery. The bombardment is relentless, churning the earth and turning the ridge into a moonscape of craters and severed limbs. At one point, a shout of gas ripples through the Japanese lines as smoke drifts across the field, causing panic among troops who lack protective gear, further disintegrating the command structure amidst the deafening roar of 105mm howitzers. By dawn on September 14, the slopes of the ridge are carpeted with the broken bodies of the Imperial Army. Over 600 Japanese soldiers lie dead on the grassy knoll, their lifeless forms entangled in barbed wire or slumped over the parapets of Marine foxholes. The invincible spiritual power of the Japanese soldier has shattered against the pragmatic firepower of the Americans. Kawaguchi, watching the slaughter from the jungle edge, realizes with a sinking heart that the airfield will not fall. The brigade has been gutted, not by a lack of courage, but by the impossibility of the terrain and the stubbornness of the enemy. The retreat from the ridge is far worse than the advance, marking the beginning of the true starvation period on Guadalcanal. The survivors, many wounded and carrying empty rifles, stagger back into the deep jungle without food or medical supplies. They leave their dead unburied, a sacrilege that weighs heavily on their souls. Reduced to scavenging, soldiers begin to eat fern roots and raw lizards, their stomachs cramping in agony. The proud soldiers who landed weeks ago are transforming into haggard ghosts, their uniforms hanging loosely on skeletal frames as they limp away from the sound of American planes taking off from the airfield they failed to capture. Major General Kawaguchi struggles to maintain order among his shattered forces as they trek west toward the Matanikau River. He knows that back in Tokyo, the failure will be viewed not as a tactical impossibility, but as a personal disgrace. The Imperial General Headquarters, refusing to accept the reality of the situation, begins to scapegoat the commander on the ground. They do not see the jungle rot eating the skin of the men or the dysentery draining their life. Only the failure to secure a map coordinate. The mopping up is over. The war of attrition has begun. As the remnants of the Kawaguchi brigade disappear into the canopy, the strategic picture shifts irrevocably. The Americans at Henderson Field are no longer a besieged landing party. They are a permanent, lethal presence growing stronger by the day. The Japanese Navy realizes that to retake the island, they must commit everything: men, ships, and material into the bottomless pit of the Solomons. The cry for reinforcements goes out across the Pacific, setting the stage for a massive naval escalation. The Battle of the Ridge is lost, but the battle for the Iron Bottom Sound is about to ignite the ocean. North of Guadalcanal lies a stretch of water that sailors on both sides have come to regard with superstitious dread. The Japanese call it the Sea of the Solomons, but the Americans have christened it Iron Bottom Sound for the sheer tonnage of steel hulls resting on its silt floor. By late September 1942, the waters are slick with oil and debris, a silent graveyard for thousands of sailors. Domination of this narrow strait depends entirely on the position of the sun. During the daylight hours, American aircraft from Henderson Field rule the skies, blasting any Japanese transport that dares to approach. But when the sun dips below the horizon, the sound belongs to the Imperial Navy and their nocturnal supply runs. The Japanese High Command, facing the impossibility of landing slow, heavy transport ships under the threat of American dive bombers, resorts to a desperate improvisation known as rat transportation. Fast destroyers, designed for fleet combat and torpedo attacks, are converted into high-speed cargo carriers. They are stripped of their spare torpedoes and crowded with hundreds of infantrymen who cling to the railings as the ships cut through the waves at 30 knots. These runs are terrifying ordeals for the soldiers, who are drenched by the ocean spray and forbidden from smoking or showing any light. Knowing that a single spark could invite an American airstrike or a collision in the pitch-black channel, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, the tenacious commander of these supply runs, faces a logistical nightmare that is slowly strangling the army ashore. A destroyer is a poor substitute for a cargo ship. It burns massive amounts of fuel to deliver a pitiful amount of supplies. When the destroyers arrive off the coast of Cape Esperance or Tassafaronga in the dead of night, the unloading process is a frantic race against the coming dawn. There are no docks, no cranes, and no barges. The sailors throw drums filled with rice and ammunition overboard, roped together, hoping the tide will carry them to the starving soldiers wading in the surf. The reality on the beach is a scene of tragic waste and exhaustion. Soldiers, weak from hunger and malaria, struggle against the dark currents to retrieve the floating drums, but many break loose and wash away or sink to the bottom. Often, only half of the supplies dispatched from the naval base at Rabaul actually reach the hands of the troops. The beach becomes a litter of waterlogged crates and rusted drums, a testament to the inefficiency of the operation. The men of the newly arrived 2nd Sendai Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, step onto the island expecting glory. only to be greeted by the hollowed-out faces of the Kawaguchi survivors and the gnawing realization that there is no food. While the Japanese struggle to bring in handfuls of rice by night, the Americans are beginning to flex their industrial muscle by day. Whenever the weather permits, lumbering transport ships and barges unload tons of heavy equipment, barbed wire, and fresh marines at Lunga Point. The disparity is sickening to the Japanese observers watching from the hills. They see bulldozers expanding the airfield, artillery tractors towing 155mm howitzers, and crates of Spam and chocolate piling up on the shore. The Cactus Air Force, operating out of Henderson Field, grows stronger every week, their Grumman Wildcat fighters buzzing over the jungle canopy like angry hornets, harassing Japanese movements and ensuring that the Imperial Army remains trapped in the dense undergrowth. The focal point of the ground war shifts west to the Matanikau River, a dark, meandering waterway with steep, muddy banks that serves as a natural barrier between the Japanese landing zones and the American perimeter. The river water is black and stagnant, concealing caimans and rotting vegetation. For the Japanese, crossing this river is the essential first step to retaking the airfield. For the Marines, holding the river is the key to survival. The area becomes a sniper's paradise and a patrol's nightmare, where sudden ambushes in the tall kunai grass leave men bleeding to death within shouting distance of their comrades. In early October, the Imperial Army decides to test the American lines along the Matanikau, leading to a series of violent clashes that reveal the evolving lethality of the enemy. The Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Nakaguma, moves into position near the mouth of the river. They are confident veterans, but they are operating with poor maps and no communications with their artillery. They attempt to infiltrate the Marine positions, relying on the same stealth tactics that worked in Malaya. However, the Marines have learned. They have established overlapping fields of fire and pre-registered artillery zones that turn the river crossings into kill zones. The engagement that follows, known later as the Second Battle of the Matanikau, is a catastrophe for the Japanese forces. A Marine battalion, guided by a scout who knows the terrain, maneuvers to trap a large force of the Japanese 4th Regiment in a narrow, wooded ravine east of the river. The Japanese soldiers, huddled in the ravine to escape mortar fire, suddenly find themselves surrounded. Marines line the ridges overlooking the gorge, looking down into the packed mass of olive-drab uniforms. It is not a battle, it is an execution. The Americans open fire with rifles, machine guns, and grenades, pouring a deluge of lead into the trapped unit. Panic ensues in the ravine as Japanese officers scream orders that cannot be heard over the roar of gunfire. Men scramble up the slippery clay walls, only to be cut down and tumble back onto the piles of their dead comrades. The discipline that holds the Imperial Army together fractures under the sheer weight of the firepower directed against them. There is no cover, no escape route, and no mercy. The ravine fills with the smoke of grenades and the stench of blood. By the time the firing stops, over 600 Japanese soldiers lie dead in the gorge, their bodies carpeting the floor of the jungle depression. It is a stunning tactical defeat that shakes the confidence of the commanders. Colonel Nakaguma is devastated by the loss of his battalion, but the high command in Tokyo refuses to pause. They are preparing for a massive, coordinated offensive later in the month, and they believe the solution lies in overwhelming force. To pave the way for this grand attack, the Imperial Navy decides to deliver the most terrifying blow of the campaign. On the night of October 13, the battleships Times Congo Times and Times Haruna Times slip into Iron Bottom Sound. These are not small destroyers, they are floating fortresses, each mounting 8 14-inch guns. Their target is not a ship, but the fragile airstrip of Henderson Field. At 0133 hours, the sky above Guadalcanal splits open. The sound of the battleship's firing is not a boom, but a physical shockwave that flattens the jungle grass and knocks men to the ground miles away. The 14-inch shells, weighing nearly 1,500 pounds each, scream through the air with a noise like a runaway freight train before slamming into the American perimeter. The earth erupts, coconut trees are snapped like matchsticks, and huge craters open up on the runways. The fuel dumps explode, sending towering pillars of fire into the night sky, illuminating the terrified faces of Marines and Japanese soldiers alike. For nearly 90 minutes, the battleships pour almost 1,000 shells into the airfield, to the Japanese soldiers watching from the hills. The bombardment looks like the deliverance they have been praying for. They cheer wildly as they see the American base engulfed in a sea of flames. They believe that no one could survive such an inferno, that the American air power has been obliterated in a single stroke. Morale soars among the starving troops. They tighten their belts and grip their rifles, convinced that the upcoming offensive will be a walkover against a decimated enemy. They do not know that while the airfield is damaged and many planes are destroyed, the spirit of the defenders remains unbroken, and the engineers are already emerging from their bunkers to fill the craters. The bombardment marks the zenith of Japanese naval intervention, a spectacular display of pyrotechnics that ultimately fails to change the strategic equation. The supply situation remains critical. The rat transportation cannot bring enough food for the thousands of new troops gathering for the attack. The heavy artillery needed to support General Maruyama's division is still stranded on the beaches or lost at sea. The bombardment has bought them a window of opportunity, but it is closing fast. The illusion of victory created by the battleships blinds the commanders to the logistical rot eating away at their army from the inside. As the smoke clears over the Matanikau and the battleships retreat north, Lieutenant General Maruyama prepares his men for the next phase. He has been ordered to move his entire division, over 20,000 men, through the dense, trackless jungle to attack the airfield from the south. He looks at the map, seeing a blank space where the road is supposed to be. He does not know that he is about to order his men onto a trail of tears that will destroy them before they even see the enemy. The Iron Bottom Sound has claimed its tribute in ships. Now the jungle waits to claim its tribute in flesh. Mid-October 1942. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, stands in a humid command tent near the Kokumbona beachhead, wiping condensation from his spectacles. He believes he finally possesses the sledgehammer required to crush the American perimeter, the elite 2nd Sendai Division. The plan is ambitious, complex, and classically Japanese in its reliance on surprise and coordination. While a diversionary attack hits the Matanikau sector to the west, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama will lead the main body of 7,000 men on a secret march through the deep interior to strike the airfield from the south. The map on Hyakutake's table shows a manageable terrain of rolling hills. It is a fatal lie. The route, soon to be infamously known as the Maruyama Road, begins as a crude trail hacked out by engineer platoons sweating in the tropical heat. The soldiers of the Sendai Division step off from the coast with high morale, believing they are marching to a glorious victory. Each man is a pack mule, burdened with a rifle, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and a heavy artillery shell strapped to his back. They are told the march will take a few days, but as they penetrate the interior, the jungle swallows them. The trail dissolves into a vertical chute of mud, slick with rain and rotting vegetation. The engineers cannot keep up with the terrain, and the orderly column begins to fracture. By the third day, the march has devolved into a slow-motion catastrophe that breaks the backs of the infantry. The humidity is absolute, trapping the heat against the soldiers' bodies until they are stewing in their own sweat. The heavy artillery pieces and mortars, critical for the upcoming assault, become anchors dragging the army to a halt. One by one, the precious 75mm mountain guns are abandoned by the side of the trail, their crews too exhausted to pull them another yard up the coral ridges. The soldiers begin to discard their own rations to lighten their loads, a decision born of exhaustion that they will regret with every fiber of their being within 48 hours. General Maruyama, struggling along the trail with his staff, realizes that his division is disintegrating before it even reaches the assembly area. The columns are strung out for miles, lost in the green twilight of the triple canopy rainforest. Communications with Hyakutake are sporadic and confused. The scheduled attack date of October 22 approaches, but the vanguard is nowhere near the objective. Maruyama is forced to request a postponement. Then another. The delay is disastrous. While the main force hacks through the jungle, the diversionary attack at the Matanikau launches on schedule, alerting the Marines that a major offensive is underway. The element of surprise is evaporating with every hour lost in the mud. Finally, on October 24, The lead elements of the Sendai Division stumble out of the jungle south of Henderson Field. They are no longer the crisp, elite soldiers who landed on the beach weeks ago. They are exhausted wrecks, covered in mud, their uniforms rotting off their backs. They have not eaten a full meal in days. Despite this, the samurai spirit drives them on. Maruyama divides his force into a left wing commanded by Major General Yumio Nasu and a right wing under Major General Kawaguchi. But confusion reigns supreme. In the pitch-black jungle darkness, units get mixed up, officers lose their bearings, and the line of departure is a chaotic mess rather than a formed battle line. As night falls, the heavens open up. A torrential tropical downpour lashes the island, turning the ground into a quagmire and drowning out all sound. At 2100 hours, the order to attack is given, but it is a disjointed, spasmodic effort. There is no creeping barrage to suppress the defenders because the artillery was left behind on the Maruyama Road. Small groups of Japanese infantry emerge from the jungle, screaming banzai as they charge the barbed wire. They are running blindly into the positions of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, and the U.S. Army's fresh 164th Infantry Regiment. The Americans are waiting, their machine guns locked and loaded. The American line erupts with a deafening volume of fire that illuminates the rain-swept battlefield. Heavy machine guns, mortars, and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister shot tear into the charging Japanese waves. The canister rounds act like giant shotguns, shredding the vegetation and the men hiding within it. The Japanese soldiers, brave to the point of madness, throw themselves onto the barbed wire to create human bridges for their comrades. But they are cut down in heaps. The jungle floor becomes a slippery carpet of blood and rain. General Nasu, leading the left wing, is shot down. The attack lacks the mass to break through. It is a series of suicidal jabs against a wall of steel. On the American side, the fighting is desperate and relentless. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone, manning a machine gun section, fights like a demon to keep his weapons operational. He runs barefoot through the mud to clear jams and haul ammunition, his hands blistering from the heat of the gun barrels. The barrels glow red-hot in the darkness, sizzling as the rain hits the steel. The piles of Japanese dead in front of his position grow so high that they block the field of fire, forcing the Marines to risk their lives to knock over the stack of bodies just to keep shooting. It is industrial-scale slaughter, a meat grinder fed by the unyielding orders of the Japanese High Command. Astonishingly, General Maruyama orders a renewal of the attack the following night, October 25. He believes that one more push, one more display of spiritual fortitude, will crack the American line. It is a death sentence for his remaining troops. The survivors, already shell-shocked and starving, are reorganized into new assault waves. They know they are walking to their deaths. This time, the Americans are even better prepared, having reinforced their lines and brought up more artillery. The result is a repetition of the previous night's horror. The Sendai Division is essentially destroying itself against the perimeter, impaling itself on the defenses of Henderson Field with zero gain. During the chaos, a few Japanese artillery pieces that were not abandoned managed to fire sporadically at the airfield. The Marines call them Pistol Pete. These nuisance guns harass the airfield but fail to stop the American planes from taking off. As the sun rises, the Cactus Air Force rises into the sky. P-39 Aerocobras and Wildcats strafe the retreating Japanese columns, hunting them down in the open Kogon grass. The air power that Maruyama hoped to neutralize is now the hammer falling on his exposed anvil. The offensive has failed completely, achieving nothing but the destruction of the army's best combat units. The retreat back along the Maruyama Road is a journey into the heart of darkness. The trail is now a corridor of misery, lined with the rotting corpses of those who died on the approach. The wounded are carried by their comrades until they can be carried no longer, then left behind to die alone in the mud. Maggots infest the wounds of the living. The stench of gangrene and dysentery hangs heavy in the stagnant air. General Maruyama, his face a mask of defeat, marches with the survivors. He has lost thousands of men, not just to bullets, but to the jungle itself. The road has become a tomb for the Sendai Division. Meanwhile, the right wing under Colonel Shoji, which had become separated during the approach, wanders the jungle in a daze. They are cut off, without food or radio contact. For weeks, they will drift through the interior, a lost battalion reduced to foraging for roots and drinking from muddy puddles. Their uniforms disintegrate, and their boots rot off their feet. They are no longer a fighting force. They are a wandering tribe of starving skeletons, hunted by American patrols and Fijian scouts. The cohesive discipline of the Imperial Army is beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by the primal instinct to survive. By the end of October, the Grand Offensive is over. The Sendai Division has ceased to exist as an effective combat unit. The beaches at Kokumbona are crowded with the wreckage of the army wounded men lying on palm fronds, staring blankly at the sky, waiting for ships that do not come. The officers can no longer hide the truth from the men or from themselves. The Americans cannot be dislodged. The supplies are gone. The reinforcements are dead. The island has changed its name in the minds of the soldiers. It is no longer Guadalcanal. It is times Gatu, times Starvation Island. And the hunger is just beginning. November 1942 descends upon Guadalcanal, not with the fury of artillery, but with the quiet, creeping horror of hunger. The grand offensives have failed. The Banzai charges have been silenced, and the Japanese 17th Army is left to rot in the jungle. The soldiers have coined a new name for this cursed place. It is no longer Guadalcanal. It is times Gatu times Starvation Island. The change in nomenclature reflects a shift in reality. The enemy is no longer the American Marine or the soldier. The enemy is the empty belly, the failing organ, and the hollow despair that wakes a man in the middle of the night, screaming for a bowl of rice that does not exist. The supply lines from Rabaul have effectively collapsed, strangled by American air and naval superiority. The destroyers of the Tokyo Express still make their daring runs, dropping drums of supplies into the surf. But the system is a tragic failure. Exhausted soldiers, too weak to swim against the currents, watch helplessly as the drums filled with precious rice and medical supplies sink to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound or drift tantalizingly out of reach. For the thousands of men hiding in the damp ravines west of the Matanikau, the daily ration shrinks to a few spoonfuls of mouldy barley, then to nothing at all. Survival becomes a primal scavenger hunt that strips the soldiers of their humanity. The jungle, once seen as a tactical cover, is now the only source of sustenance. Men wander the undergrowth searching for edible fern roots, papaya stems, and wild taro. They learn to identify which lizards are poisonous and which can be eaten raw. Groups of soldiers crawl through the mud to catch land crabs, cracking the shells with rocks to suck out the meager meat. The pangs of hunger are a constant. Physical assault, a cramping agony that bends men double and clouds their vision with black spots. The diaries found on the bodies of the dead tell the story of this slow descent into hell. Private First Class Wada writes with trembling hands about the obsession that consumes them all. He describes dreams of his mother's cooking, vivid hallucinations where he can smell the miso soup and taste the pickled plums. When he wakes, he is chewing on his leather gear strap or a handful of moss. The entries become shorter as the days pass, the handwriting deteriorating into jagged scrawls. Today, no rice. Reads one entry. Yesterday, no rice. Tomorrow, I will die. The ink fades. Just as the life fades from the writer, disease follows hunger like a shadow, capitalizing on the weakened immune systems of the troops. Malaria, the jungle shake, sweeps through the ranks with devastating speed. Lacking quinine, the men have no defense against the mosquitoes that swarm in clouds at dusk. A soldier stricken with malaria burns with a fever of 104 degrees, shivering violently in the tropical heat, his teeth chattering so hard they crack. Dysentery is even more humiliating and lethal. It turns the bivouac areas into open sewers. Men are too weak to walk to the latrines, so they lie in their own filth, their bodies expelling fluids until they are desiccated husks. The psychological toll on the officers is profound as they watch their command disintegrate. The strict hierarchy of the Imperial Army begins to buckle under the weight of biological necessity. Reports reach headquarters of soldiers stealing food from their dying comrades. Or even worse, whispers of cannibalism in the most isolated sectors. Officers who once demanded perfect polish and discipline now look the other way when a soldier fails to salute. They cannot reprimand a man for being dirty when his uniform is rotting off his body. Nor can they punish a sentry for sleeping when he has not eaten in a week. In a desperate attempt to alleviate the suffering, the Japanese Navy executes a brilliant tactical victory at the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30. Rear Admiral Tanaka's destroyers, attempting another supply run, are intercepted by a superior American cruiser force. In a display of supreme night-fighting skill, the Japanese launch their long-lance torpedoes, sinking one American cruiser and heavily damaging 3 others. It is a humiliating defeat for the U.S. Navy, but for the soldiers on the shore, it is a hollow victory. The destroyers, forced to fight, do not deliver the supply drums. The battle is won. But the army continues to starve. By December, the physical appearance of the 17th Army is grotesque. The soldiers are no longer recognizable as the healthy young men who left Japan. They are walking skeletons, their skin stretched tight over protruding ribs and pelvic bones. Their eyes are sunken deep into their skulls, burning with a feverish, glassy intensity. Hair falls out in clumps, and teeth loosen in receding gums due to scurvy. When they move, they shuffle like geriatrics, using their rifles as crutches. A man who weighs 100 pounds is considered healthy. Most weigh far less. They are ghosts haunting a jungle that is consuming them. The medical facilities are nothing more than open-air charnel houses. The hospitals are merely designated clearings where the sick are dragged to die together. There is no medicine, no bandages, and no anesthesia. Army surgeons, helpless to treat the infections, watch as gangrene eats away limbs. Maggots infest the wounds of the living. A horrific mercy that actually cleans the dead tissue but drives the men to the brink of insanity. The smell of the hospitals is a thick, cloying stench of rotting flesh and excrement that can be smelled hundreds of yards away. A scent that never leaves the nostrils of the survivors. Despite the horror, a strange, fatalistic camaraderie persists among some units. They share the last grains of rice with a ritualistic solemnity. They pick the lice off each other's backs and talk about the harvest festivals back home in Aomori or Hiroshima. They know they have been abandoned by the high command, that the successes broadcast on Tokyo radio are lies. Yet, they endure. They endure because there is nowhere to go. To surrender is unthinkable, a shame worse than death, so they sit in the mud, clutching their Type 38 rifles, waiting for the end with a stoicism that terrifies the few American patrols that encounter them. The contrast with the enemy adds a psychological torture to the physical suffering. When the wind blows from the east, it carries the scent of the American lines to the Japanese positions. It brings the smell of coffee, frying bacon, and cigarette smoke. To the starving Japanese, it is the smell of a different universe. They watch through binoculars as American planes land daily, unloading tons of crates. They see the Marines playing baseball on the beach during lulls in the fighting. The realization strikes deep. They are fighting a nation that can ship ice cream to the equator, while the Emperor's soldiers cannot even get a bowl of rice gruel. As the rainy season intensifies in late December, the island turns into a watery grave. The foxholes fill with water, forcing men to sleep standing up or perched on logs. The constant moisture causes jungle rot, fungal infections that eat away the skin between the toes and in the groin. Boots, stitched with cotton thread, fall apart, leaving men barefoot on the sharp coral and thorny floor. The rain is relentless, a hammering noise that drowns out conversation and thought. It washes away the shallow graves, exposing the limbs of the dead, as if the island is refusing to accept the bodies. New Year's Eve approaches, a time of supreme importance in Japanese culture. But there is no celebration on time's Ga-2 asterisk. There are no rice cakes, no sake, no letters from home. General Hyakutake, huddled in his command bunker, sends a message to Tokyo that is finally devoid of optimism. He reports that the army is incapable of offensive action. The divine wind has not blown. The 38th Division, the last reinforcement to arrive, has been thrown into the line only to be swallowed by the same starvation that claimed the Sendai. The diary entries stop. The pencils drop from weak fingers. The The silence of the grave settles over the western end of Guadalcanal. The breakdown is total. It is no longer a military organization. It is a biological tragedy. The Starvation Island has claimed its victory, not through strategy, but through metabolism. The officers and men of the Imperial Army have passed beyond the point of hunger into a state of lethargic acceptance. They are waiting for death. But the High Command has one final surprise for them. It is not a reinforcement, nor a victory. It is a decision that has never been made in the history of the modern Japanese army, a retreat. But for thousands, the order will come too late. January 1943 brings a silence to the Japanese sector that is more terrifying than the roar of bombardment. In the dank, mold-infested command bunker near the Tasafaronga shoreline, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake sits in a stupor of exhaustion and illness. The commander of the 17th Army, once a figure of robust authority, is now a shadow of himself, his body ravaged by the same malnutrition that is killing his troops. Around him, his staff officers move with lethargic slowness, their uniforms hanging in tatters, the operational maps on the wall, peeling in the humidity, no longer show attack vectors or grand strategies. They only mark the shrinking perimeter of a force that has ceased to be an army and has become a tragedy. The breakdown of order begins at the top, fueled by a poisonous friction between the army and the navy. In Rabaul and Tokyo, the arguments rage over culpability and resources. The army demands more ships to land fresh divisions, while the navy, having lost dozens of warships in the Iron Bottom Sound, refuses to sacrifice any more vessels for a lost cause. This strategic paralysis filters down to the front lines as a sense of total abandonment. The soldiers on Guadalcanal realize they are pawns in a bureaucratic stalemate. They are not dying for the emperor anymore. They are dying because the High Command cannot agree on how to save them or how to admit defeat. Among the rank and file, a grim piece of folklore begins to circulate, a medical table of doom that is whispered from foxhole to foxhole. It is known as the life expectancy list, a self-diagnosis tool born of despair. The soldiers recite it like a mantra. If a man can stand up and walk, he has 30 days left to live. If he can sit up but cannot stand, he has 3 weeks. If he cannot sit up but can urinate properly, he has 3 days. If he must urinate lying down, he will be dead by morning. It is a cold, clinical assessment of their own mortality, accepted with a chilling fatalism. The jungle floor is littered with men who have reached the final stages of this countdown. They are the standing dead, soldiers who lean against trees or crouch in their dugouts, too weak to move but not yet corpses. Their eyes follow the movements of the few healthy men left, but they do not speak. The energy required to form words is too precious to waste. Flies cover their faces, crawling into the corners of their eyes and mouths, but the men do not brush them away. They have surrendered their bodies to the island before their hearts have stopped beating. The boundary between the living and the dead has evaporated completely. Discipline, the iron backbone of the Imperial Army, finally snaps under the biological imperative of hunger. Theft becomes rampant. Soldiers watch their comrades with suspicion, guarding their meager rations of mouldy rice or dried lizard meat with the ferocity of wild animals. In the rear areas, officers hoarding secret stashes of food are murdered by their own subordinates, or simply robbed in the night. The hierarchical structure that held the unit together against the Americans dissolves into small, predatory bands of survivors. The concept of times, Bushido times the way of the warrior, cannot survive in a stomach that has been empty for weeks. The hospitals established in the ravines behind Mount Austin are scenes from a nightmare that would break the sanity of a civilized observer. There are no doctors, only orderlies who are themselves dying of malaria. The sick are laid out on the mud in rows, hundreds of them, with no shelter from the relentless tropical rain. There is no medicine to stop the dysentery, so the ground turns into a slurry of human waste. When a man dies in the night, he is often left where he lies because the living are too weak to drag the body to a grave. The dead endure the rain alongside the dying, their decomposing forms adding to the stench that permeates the entire sector. Despite this internal collapse, the war does not stop. The American 4T Corps, now reinforced and fresh, begins its final offensive to clear the island. They push toward the Gifu strongpoint and the Galloping Horse Ridge, blasting the jungle with heavy artillery and flamethrowers. The Japanese defenders, though starving and diseased, fight back with a mechanical, zombie-like resistance. They stay in their bunkers because they lack the strength to run. They pull triggers with trembling fingers, cutting down Americans even as they themselves are on the verge of death. It is not courage in the traditional sense, it is the final, instinctive reflex of a dying organism. To the American soldiers advancing through the jungle, the enemy has transformed into something pitiable and grotesque. They find Japanese positions where the machine gunners are chained to their weapons, or where officers have committed suicide rather than face capture. They find diaries filled with poetry about cherry blossoms and mothers, lying next to bodies that look like mummies. The hatred that defined the earlier battles begins to mix with a revulsion and a strange, horrified pity. The Americans realize they are not fighting a military force anymore. They are liquidating a humanitarian disaster that happens to be armed. Back in Tokyo, the emperor finally intervenes, breaking the deadlock that is killing his army. In a somber conference at the imperial palace, the decision is made to turn the course. The word retreat is never used. It is forbidden. Instead, the operation is framed as a redeployment to a new line of defense. But everyone in the room knows the truth. The myth of Japanese invincibility has died in the jungles of Guadalcanal. The order for times Operation K times the evacuation of the survivors is drafted. It is a plan of desperation, a gamble to save the few thousand skeletons who still draw breath. The orders for the withdrawal are sent to Rabaul and then transmitted to Guadalcanal, but they must be kept a closely guarded secret. If the Americans discover the plan, their aircraft and PT boats will massacre the evacuation fleet. To the soldiers on the ground, the sudden flurry of radioactivity and the arrival of new orders feels like a cruel joke. They are told to prepare for a new offensive. They are ordered to move toward the coast at Cape Esperance. Many of the men, too weak to walk, interpret this as a death march. They do not know that the destroyers are coming to take them home. They believe they are being sent to die in a new location. The movement toward the coast is a filtration process that separates the lucky from the damned. Those who can stand, per the life expectancy table, begin the slow, agonizing shuffle to the northwest. They use bamboo sticks as canes, helping each other over the tree roots. But for the thousands who cannot stand the ones in the 3-day or urinate lying down category, there is no salvation. They are left behind in the foxholes and the hospital clearings. Some are given hand grenades and told to protect the rear. It is a euphemism for suicide. The army is amputating its own gangrenous limbs to save the head. As the sun sets on the final days of January, the silence on the island deepens. The artillery fire from the American lines seems distant to the men left in the rear guard. They sit in the darkness, clutching the grenades that are their tickets to oblivion. They listen to the sounds of the jungle, the screech of birds, the rustle of land crabs, and they remember the snowy mountains of Japan or the busy streets of Osaka. They are the sacrifice that the empire demands. They will never know that their suffering was the turning point of the war. The moment the tide receded forever, the breakdown of order is now complete. The 17th Army is no longer a fighting force. It is a refugee column moving through hell. Officers have stripped off their rank insignia to blend in with the men. The regimental flags, once carried with such pride, are burned or buried in the mud. The only law left is the law of survival, and even that is being repealed by the laws of physics and biology. Guadalcanal has stripped them of everything: their pride, their strength, their humanity, leaving only the raw, exposed nerve of existence. And yet, for the survivors shuffling toward the beach, a tiny, fragile spark of hope begins to flicker in the darkness. February 1943 begins with a masterclass in deception that bewilders the American commanders. The United States intelligence services, intercepting increased radio traffic and observing a surge in destroyer activity, are convinced that the Japanese are preparing for yet another massive offensive. They believe the Tokyo Express is bringing in fresh divisions to make one last attempt to retake Henderson Field. General Alexander Patch, now commanding the American forces, orders his troops to proceed with extreme caution, fearing a trap. He does not realize that the destroyers are not coming to disgorge fresh warriors, but to extract the hollowed-out shells of men who can barely lift their rifles. The Japanese High Command is executing Operation Key, a high-wire magic trick performed under the nose of a superior enemy. On the beaches of Cape Esperance, the assembly point for the evacuation, the scene is one of disciplined purgatory. Thousands of ragged survivors have gathered in the darkness, hiding under the palm fronds to avoid American spotter planes. They are the lucky ones, the men who passed the urinate standing up test and survived the trek to the coast. They wait in absolute silence, staring out at the black water of Iron Bottom Sound. There is no jostling, no panic. The iron discipline of the Imperial Army, which had frayed during the starvation months, returns for this final act. They are leaving, but they are leaving in formation, clutching the boxes of ashes that contain the spirits of their dead comrades. The first evacuation run on the night of February 1 is a frantic race against time and tide. A squadron of 20 destroyers, led by the intrepid Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto, cuts through the waves, dodging American PT boats and air attacks. As the ships approach the shore, they lower their cutters and barges. The extraction process reveals the shocking physical state of the 17th Army. The soldiers are so emaciated that they cannot climb the cargo nets draped over the sides of the destroyers. They hang there like dried leaves, their strength failing, until burly sailors have to climb down and physically haul them up onto the steel decks. Once on board, the contrast between the rescuers and the rescued is heartbreaking. The sailors, wearing clean white uniforms and smelling of soap, look like aliens to the infantrymen who are covered in layers of mud, fungus, and excrement. The stench of the soldiers is so overpowering that some sailors gag, yet they treat the survivors with tender care. They offer them sweet tea and soft rice balls, the first real food many have tasted in months. The soldiers weep silently as they eat, the simple taste of sugar overwhelming their senses. For the first time in half a year, they are safe from the jungle, the malaria, and the relentless American artillery. The operation continues on the nights of February 4 and February 7. A miracle of logistical timing. The Japanese Navy, often criticized for its arrogance, performs heroically to save its army counterparts. They brave mines and air raids to return again and again to the dark coast. In total, they manage to pull over 10,000 men off the island. It is a Dunkirk in the Pacific, a successful withdrawal from a catastrophic defeat. But for every man pulled onto a destroyer, 2 lie dead in the jungle behind them. The evacuation is a salvation for the individuals, but a funeral for the army. Behind the retreating columns, a tragic rear guard remains to maintain the illusion of a still active front. These are the men too sick to move, or volunteers who have chosen to die to buy time for their comrades. They man the machine gun nests and fire sporadically at the advancing Americans to simulate a strong defense. They know there will be no boat for them. Their fate is sealed by the rising sun and the encroaching enemy. When their ammunition runs out, they clasp their hands in prayer towards the Imperial Palace and pull the pins on their grenades. The jungle absorbs the explosions, silencing the last defiance of the Empire on Guadalcanal. By the afternoon of February 9, the American forces finally close the pincer, linking up at Cape Esperance. They expect a climactic battle, a final banzai charge that will turn the beach red. Instead, they find a ghost town. The beaches are littered with abandoned equipment, piles of rusted rifles, broken radio sets, and empty landing barges. But the enemy is gone. A cryptic message is sent from the American commander to headquarters Tokyo. Express no longer has terminals on Guadalcanal. The realization dawns slowly. The Japanese have not just been defeated, they have vanished, slipping away into the mist like the phantoms they resembled. The survivors are offloaded at Rabaul and Bougainville, where the full extent of the disaster becomes visible to the rear echelon troops. The nurses and support staff stare in horror at the procession of skeletons disembarking from the ships. These men, the elite of the Sendai and 38th Divisions, look like geriatric patients. General Hyakutake, the proud commander, is a broken man, his face a mask of grief. The hospitals are immediately overwhelmed. Many of the survivors, their bodies unable to process the sudden intake of rich food, die within days of their rescue. The Starvation Island claims its victims even after they have left its shores. The strategic cost of the campaign is staggering. Japan has lost over 20,000 men on Guadalcanal. They have lost hundreds of aircraft and dozens of irreplaceable warships. But more importantly, they have lost the initiative. For the first time in the war, the Japanese expansion has been checked and reversed. The perimeter of the empire has been breached. The Americans have proven that they can fight in the jungle, that they can endure the same hardships, and that their industrial might can crush the spiritual will of the samurai. The myth of invincibility that sustained the Japanese soldier since the Russo-Japanese War has been buried in the mud of the Matanikau. In Tokyo, the propaganda machine tries to spin the withdrawal as a strategic repositioning, but the leadership knows the truth. The war has turned. The attrition rate in the Solomons has bled the Navy dry of its best pilots and the army of its best infantry. From this point on, Japan will be fighting a defensive war. A long, retreating action across the Pacific. The green hell of Guadalcanal was the crucible where the fate of the war was decided. It proved that spirit alone cannot stop a bulldozer, and that an army without supplies is nothing more than a gathering of graves. For the Americans, Guadalcanal becomes a legend, a name etched alongside Bunker Hill and Gettysburg. It transforms the Marine Corps into a modern fighting force and teaches the army the brutal lessons of jungle warfare. But for the survivors on both sides, the island remains a place of haunted memory. Years later, veterans will wake up sweating in the night, smelling the rotting vegetation and hearing the buzzing of the malaria mosquitoes. They remember the friends they buried in shallow graves and the enemies they killed in the dark. The animosity fades with time, replaced by a shared, silent understanding of the horror they endured together. Today, the jungle has reclaimed the battlefield. The kunai grass grows tall over Bloody Ridge, hiding the scars in the earth. The Alligator Creek flows quietly into the sea, its waters clear of blood. The rusted hulks of tanks and landing craft still sit in the undergrowth, slowly dissolving into red dust. If you stand on the beach at Tassafaronga at sunset, looking out over the Iron Bottom Sound, the water is peaceful, but beneath the waves lie the bones of ships and men, and in the jungle behind, the spirits of the Starvation Island still watch the sea, waiting for a transport that will never come. The story of Guadalcanal is not just a story of strategy and gunfire. It is a testament to the limits of human endurance. It is the story of how an empire, blinded by its own hubris, sent its sons to die in a place where nature was the ultimate victor. The silence that hangs over the island now is the only appropriate memorial for the thousands who starved, fought, and died in the green twilight. The war moved on to Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But the shadow of time's Garter times stretched all the way to Tokyo. The hunger ended in February 1943, but the emptiness remains forever.